The rope felt heavier than it should have in Levi Cade's weathered hands as he stood beneath the barn's crossbeam, Montana's bitter wind whistling through the gaps in the weathered wood. 53 years of living had taught him that some burdens never lighten, and the foreclosure notice crumpled in his coat pocket felt like the final weight his shoulders couldn't bear. His wife's grave marker gleamed cold in the moonlight beyond the barn door, and the cattle that once filled these fields had long since been sold to pay debts that kept multiplying like prairie grass after rain. But as he fashioned the noose with hands that remembered gentler tasks, a soft rustling from the hayloft above made him pause. Someone else was sharing his sanctuary of despair. What would happen when two souls at the end of their rope discovered they weren't as alone as they thought? The first light of dawn crept across the Montana plains like spilled honey, casting long shadows through the broken slats of Levi Cade's barn. He'd been awake most of the night, sitting on an overturned feed bucket with his back against the rough-hewn wall, studying the woman who'd fallen from his hayloft like some strange angel of mercy. Sadie Lane looked smaller in the pale morning light, her face drawn with pain, but her eyes still holding that fierce spark that had stopped him from completing his grim business the night before. Her dark hair was matted with hay and dried blood from a gash along her temple, and the way she favored her left side told him more than words ever could about the extent of her injuries. "You planning to stare at me all morning, or are you going to offer a lady some coffee?" Her voice carried the rasp of someone who'd been screaming, though whether from pain or rage, Levi couldn't tell. He rose slowly, his joints protesting after a lifetime of hard riding and harder living. "Coffee's about all I got left to offer anyone," he said, moving toward the small potbelly stove he'd rigged up in the corner of the barn. His house had been cold and empty since Martha died, and he'd taken to sleeping out here among the ghosts of better times. As he worked the bellows and coaxed life into the embers, Levi found himself stealing glances at this unexpected guest. She'd managed to prop herself up against a saddle, her legs stretched out at an angle that spoke of permanent damage. But there was nothing defeated in her posture, nothing that suggested she saw herself as broken. "Name's Sadie," she said, watching him measure coffee grounds with the careful precision of a man who'd learned to make every bean count. "Sadie Lane, though I reckon that name's about as useful as yesterday's newspaper right about now." Levi Cade. He didn't turn around, focusing instead on the familiar ritual of coffee making. "This is my spread, though the bank might argue that point come next week. Foreclosure? 3 months overdue on payments I never should have agreed to in the first place." The words came easier than he'd expected. Maybe it was the strange intimacy of dawn, or maybe it was having someone to talk to who wasn't expecting him to be strong. "Lost my wife 2 years back to the fever, lost most of my cattle to a harsh winter, and lost my pride somewhere along the way." Sadie was quiet for a long moment, studying him with eyes that seemed older than her years. She couldn't be more than 25, but something in her gaze spoke of hard-earned wisdom. "What stopped you?" she asked finally. Levi's hand stilled on the coffee pot. "What do you mean?" "That rope's still hanging there." She nodded toward the crossbeam where the noose swayed gently in the morning breeze. "Question is whether it was me falling out of that loft or something else that changed your mind." He poured coffee into 2 battered tin cups, grateful for the task that kept his hands busy. The truth was, he wasn't entirely sure himself. Maybe it was the sound of another person's breathing in his sanctuary of solitude. Maybe it was the way she'd looked at him when she hit the barn, floor not with pity or fear, but with a kind of recognition, as if she understood exactly what she'd interrupted. "Figured it'd be poor manners to leave a guest hanging around," he said, handing her one of the cups. Despite everything, Sadie Laftea, rich, genuine sound that seemed to fill the empty spaces in the barn. Poor manners indeed. She accepted the coffee with steady hands, inhaling the bitter steam before taking a careful sip. "This is good coffee, Levi Cade, too good to waste on a dead man." They sat in companionable silence as the sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist that clung to the prairie grass. Levi found himself studying the land beyond the barn doors with new eyes, seeing not just the failing ranch, but the rolling hills that stretched toward the horizon, the way the light caught on the creek that meandered through his property, the stubborn wildflowers that bloomed despite the harsh soil. "How long you been hiding in my loft?" he asked eventually. 3 days, maybe 4. Time gets fuzzy when you're trying not to die. Sadie set down her cup and began working her fingers through her tangled hair, wincing as she encountered knots and debris. "Crawled most of the way here after the ambush. Your barn was the first shelter I found that wasn't already occupied by something with teeth." Ambush. Stagecoach to Billings. Should have been a routine run, but someone had other plans. Her voice took on a flat, matter-of-fact tone that didn't quite hide the pain underneath. "They were waiting for us at Devil's Canyon, knew exactly which coach would be carrying what. Someone on the inside set us up." Levi had heard stories of stage holdups, but they usually involved demands for money or valuables, not the kind of violence that left a young woman crawling through the wilderness with a broken back. "You were carrying something they wanted?" "I was the something they wanted." Sadie's hand moved unconsciously to her side, where Levi could see the outline of a small leather pouch beneath her torn shirt. "My family. Let's just say we had business dealings that didn't sit well with certain folks. When they couldn't get to my father directly, they decided to send a message through me. The implications settled between them like smoke from a dying fire." Levi had lived long enough to understand the kind of men who used violence as currency, who saw women and children as acceptable casualties in their endless feuds over money and territory. "They think you're dead?" "They shot the coach driver and guard first, then worked on the passengers. I was the last one left when they—" She paused, her composure cracking slightly. "When they pushed the coach off the canyon road, should have been the end of it, should have been the end of me. But the coach got caught up in some trees partway down, and I managed to crawl out before it went all the way to the bottom." Levi felt something cold settle in his stomach. "How many others?" 7 passengers, plus the driver and guard. 9 good people who had the misfortune to be traveling with Sadie Lane on the wrong day. The weight of survivor's guilt was something Levi understood all too well. He'd carried his own load of it since Martha's death, wondering if he could have done something different, been a better husband, somehow prevented the fever that took her. But 9 innocent lives was a burden that would break most people. "That wasn't your fault," he said quietly. "Tell that to their families." Sadie's fingers worried at the leather pouch, a nervous habit that spoke of precious cargo. "Tell that to Mrs. Henderson, who was traveling to see her new grandbaby, or to young Tommy Walsh, barely 16 and heading to work his uncle's claim. They died because someone wanted me dead, and that's a fact I'll carry to my grave." The morning air had grown warmer, but Levi felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. He'd spent the last 2 years convinced that his troubles were his alone, that his failures as a rancher and husband were isolated tragedies. But listening to Sadie's story, he began to understand that some kinds of evil cast long shadows, touching lives in ways that decent people could barely comprehend. "What kind of business was your family in?" he asked. Sadie was quiet for so long that Levi thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "My father was a banker, honest as the day is long, which turned out to be his downfall." She touched the leather pouch again, a gesture that was becoming increasingly meaningful. "He discovered some irregularities in the territorial accounts, money being moved around in ways that didn't make sense. When he started asking questions, he found out that some very important people were helping themselves to funds meant for railroad development and Indian treaties." Levi understood immediately. Territorial funds meant federal money, and federal money meant the kind of corruption that could reach all the way to Washington, the kind of corruption that left bodies in its wake. He went to the authorities. He tried. Turns out the authorities were part of the problem. Sadie's laugh was bitter as winter wind. The territorial governor, the federal marshal, even some of the railroad bosses, they were all in on it. When my father threatened to go over their heads to contact officials back east, they decided it was easier to eliminate the problem than to solve it. "Your whole family?" "House fire. Happened real convenient, like while I was visiting my aunt in Helena." Sadie's composure finally cracked. tears cutting clean tracks through the dust on her cheeks. They killed my parents, my little brother, even our housekeeper. Made it look like an accident, but I knew better. Levi reached out instinctively, covering her small hand with his larger, calloused one. Martha's wedding ring, which he still wore on his left hand, caught the morning light and sent a small rainbow dancing across the barn wall. That's when you decided to run. That's when I decided to fight. Sadie's tears had stopped, replaced by something harder and more dangerous. My father kept detailed records of everything he discovered. Names, dates, amounts, bank transfers, all of it. The men who killed my family think they're safe, but they're wrong. She pulled the leather pouch from beneath her shirt, holding it carefully as if it contained something that might explode. Everything's in here. Every crooked deal, every stolen dollar, every name that should be on a wanted poster instead of a ballot. This little pouch could bring down half the territorial government and take a few railroad barons with it. Levi stared at the innocent-looking leather bundle, understanding now why men would kill an entire stagecoach full of people to get their hands on it. And you're planning to do what with it? Get it to someone who can't be bought, someone with enough power to see justice done. Sadie tucked the pouch back beneath her shirt. Only problem is, I'm not sure such a person exists, and I'm not exactly in traveling condition at the moment. The sound of hoofbeats on the dirt road beyond the ranch made both of them freeze. It was still early for casual visitors, and Levi couldn't remember the last time anyone had ridden out to his place for a social call. He moved to the barn door, peering carefully through a gap in the boards. 3 riders were approaching at an easy pace, their clothes marking them as townspeople rather than working cowboys. The man in the lead wore a banker's black suit, and the kind of self-satisfied expression that Levi had learned to distrust on sight. "Company," he said quietly, turning back to Sadie. "You recognize any of these men?" Sadie crawled painfully to where she could see through the gap, her face going pale as she studied the approaching riders. "The one in front is Clarence Whitmore, president of the Territorial Bank. The other 2." She swallowed hard. "The other 2 were at Devil's Canyon when they pushed the stagecoach over the edge." Levi felt something cold and familiar settle in his chest, the same feeling he'd gotten years ago when he'd worn a deputy's badge and known that violence was coming, whether he wanted it or not. The difference was that this time he had something worth protecting. "Stay hidden," he said, helping Sadie crawl behind a stack of hay bales. "Whatever happens, don't let them see you." "Levi." "Whatever happens," he repeated, then walked out to meet the 3 men who'd come calling on a morning that had started with such unexpected hope. The confrontation that followed would change everything, but as Levi stepped into the morning sunshine with empty hands and a heart that was no longer quite so empty, he found himself thinking about Martha's ring on his finger and the way Sadie had looked at him when she'd called his coffee too good to waste on a dead man. Maybe she was right. Maybe some things were worth staying alive for after all. Clarence Whitmore dismounted with the careful precision of a man who spent more time behind a desk than in a saddle, brushing imaginary dust from his black coat before approaching Levi with a smile that never reached his eyes. The 2 men flanking him remained mounted, their hands resting casually near their gun belts in a way that suggested they were comfortable with violence. "Mr. Cade," Whitmore said, extending a gloved hand that Levi pointedly ignored, "I trust you've had time to consider our final offer regarding your outstanding debt." Levi kept his expression neutral, though every instinct honed by years of reading dangerous men told him this visit had nothing to do with banking business. "Wasn't aware we had any more discussing to do, Whitmore. The papers you sent were pretty clear about my options." Indeed they were. Whitmore reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document, the official seal of the Territorial Bank gleaming in the morning light. "Foreclosure proceedings, effective immediately. I'm afraid your grace period has expired." The paper felt heavier than it should have in Levi's hands, each word a nail in the coffin of everything he'd built with Martha. But as he read the formal language of legal theft, he found himself thinking not of his own losses, but of the young woman hiding in his barn, of the 9 innocent people who died for the contents of a leather pouch. of the kind of men who would burn down a family just to keep their crimes hidden. Funny thing about timing, Levi said, folding the foreclosure notice carefully. 3 months ago, you were willing to extend my payments. Now, all of a sudden, you need this land cleared out today. Whitmore's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. Business circumstances change, Mr. Cade. The bank has decided to pursue a more aggressive collection policy. That wouldn't have anything to do with whoever's been asking questions around town about missing stagecoaches, would it? The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. One of the mounted Mina, lean, hard-faced character, with scars on his knuckles shifted slightly in his saddle, his coat falling open to reveal a pair of matched Colts. "I'm not sure what you're implying," Whitmore said, his voice carefully neutral. "But I'd hate for you to say something you might regret." Levi had been in enough confrontations to recognize a threat when he heard one. But he'd also been a lawman long enough to know when men were fishing for information they didn't have. They suspected Sadie might have survived, but they weren't certain. That small uncertainty was the only advantage he had. "Not implying anything," Levi said, "just noting that it's interesting how many coincidences seem to be happening all at once." The scarred man leaned forward in his saddle. "Maybe we should search the property, Mr. Whitmore. Make sure there's nothing here that shouldn't be." "Now, Jake, let's not be hasty." Whitmore held up a restraining hand, but his eyes never left Levi's face. "Mr. Cade is a reasonable man. I'm sure he understands that cooperation serves everyone's interests." "Cooperation with what exactly?" Levi asked. "There was a tragic accident several days ago. A stagecoach went over the canyon road. Terrible business. We're trying to account for all the passengers, make sure their families receive proper notification." Whitmore's tone was perfectly reasonable, the voice of a concerned citizen doing his civic duty. "If any survivors happen to wander this way, injured and confused, we'd want to know about it. For their own good, of course." The lie was so smooth, delivered with such practiced sincerity, that Levi almost admired the craftsmanship. This was a man who'd made a career out of bending the truth to serve his purposes, who could probably convince a drowning man to buy water. "Haven't seen any stagecoach survivors," Levi said truthfully. "Just been me and my grief out here." "Of course." Whitmore tucked the foreclosure notice back into his coat. "Well then, I suppose our business is concluded. You have until sunset to vacate the premises. The bank will be sending a crew tomorrow to take inventory of any remaining assets." He turned to go, then paused as if struck by an afterthought. "Oh, and Mr. Cade, there's a substantial reward being offered for information about that stagecoach incident. $500 for any survivor brought in alive. Dead or alive, actually sometimes the dead can tell us just as much as the living." The threat was clear now, stripped of all pretense. They weren't just looking for Sadie, they were offering to pay for her corpse. And they were making sure Levi understood that his cooperation could be bought or his silence could be permanent. "I'll keep that in mind," Levi said. Whitmore nodded and remounted his horse, but the scarred man named Jake continued to study Levi with the calculating gaze of a predator sizing up prey. "Something else on your mind, Jake?" Levi asked. "Just wondering why a man who's about to lose everything would be so calm about it," Jake replied. "Most folks, they'd be begging, trying to make some kind of deal. You seem almost relieved." It was a perceptive observation, and Levi felt a stab of unease at how easily this killer had read him. "Maybe I'm just tired of fighting a losing battle." "Maybe." Jake's hand drifted closer to his gun. "Or maybe you got something else on your mind. Something that makes losing a ranch seem like small potatoes." For a long moment, the two men stared at each other across the dusty yard. Levi could feel the weight of his own Colt tucked into his belt beneath his shirt, could calculate the distance between them, could almost see the way the confrontation would unfold if it came to violence. But he also knew that gunfighting was a young man's game, and he hadn't been young for a very long time. "Jake," Whitmore called sharply, "we have other business to attend to." The scarred man held Levi's gaze for another heartbeat, then touched the brim of his hat in a mocking salute. "See you around, Cade." The three riders departed at the same easy pace they'd arrived with, but Levi remained in the yard until they disappeared over the ridge. Only then did he allow himself to breathe properly, his hands trembling slightly as the adrenaline of confrontation began to fade. When he returned to the barn, he found Sadie exactly where he'd left her, but her face was white with strain and her hands were shaking. "They're going to kill you," she said without preamble. "You know that, don't you? They can't afford to leave any loose ends, and now you're a loose end." "Maybe." Levi poured himself another cup of coffee, surprised to find his hands steady again. "But they're not sure what I know, and that gives us some time." "Time for what? You heard them. You have until sunset to clear out. Where are you going to go? What are you going to do?" Levi was quiet for a long moment, thinking about Martha's ring on his finger, about the foreclosure notice in his pocket, about the way Sadie had looked at him when she'd fallen from the hayloft, like an answer to a prayer he hadn't known he was praying. "I'm not going anywhere," he said finally. "Levi, this is my land. Martha's buried here, and I'll be damned if I'm going to let a bunch of murderers and thieves run me off it." He looked at Sadie, seeing not just a broken young woman, but a partner in something that suddenly felt like the most important thing he'd ever done. "Besides, you can't travel in your condition, and I'm not about to abandon you to those wolves. They'll come back with more men. You can't fight them all." "Maybe not, but I can make them pay a price for what they want." Levi moved to a corner of the barn where several loose boards concealed a small hiding space. From within, he withdrew a gun belt and holster that had seen better days, along with a well-maintained Colt revolver and a box of ammunition. "You were a lawman," Sadie said, understanding dawning in her eyes. "Deputy sheriff for 8 years before I married Martha and decided to try my hand at ranching." Levi strapped on the gun belt, adjusting it until it sat comfortably on his hips. The weight of it felt familiar, like greeting an old friend after a long absence. "Turns out I was better at keeping the peace than I was at raising cattle." 8 years is a long time. Did you ever kill anyone?" 3 men over the years. 2 were trying to rob the bank. 1 was beating his wife to death with a shovel. Levi checked the cylinder of his Colt, then slipped it back into its holster. "Never lost a minute's sleep over any of them." Sadie studied him with new eyes, seeing past the broken-down rancher to the man he'd been before grief and failure had worn him down. "What's your plan?" "First, we make this place defensible. Second, we figure out how to get that evidence of yours to someone who can use it. Third," he paused, thinking about Whitmore's cold smile and Jake's calculating stare. "Third, we make sure those bastards understand what happens when they threaten decent people." For the first time since falling from the hayloft, Sadie smiled a fierce, predatory expression that transformed her entire face. "I like the sound of that plan." As they began to prepare for the confrontation that was surely coming, Levi found himself thinking about the rope that still hung from the barn's crossbeam. 12 hours ago, it had represented the end of everything he cared about. Now it seemed like nothing more than a reminder of how quickly circumstances could change, how a single moment of grace could transform surrender into determination. He had a ranch to defend, a woman to protect, and a score to settle with the kind of men who thought power gave them the right to destroy innocent lives. It wasn't the future he'd planned when he'd climbed into that loft with murder in his heart, but it was a future worth fighting for. And Levi Cade had always been good at fighting. The first order of business was getting Sadie properly settled and understanding the full extent of her injuries. Levi had seen enough wounded men during his years as a deputy to recognize when someone was putting on a brave front, and Sadie was clearly in more pain than she was letting on. "Let me take a look at that back," he said, gathering some clean rags and a bottle of whiskey he kept for medicinal purposes. "Can't have you passing out from infection when we need to be ready for trouble." Sadie's jaw tightened. "I can manage just fine." "I'm sure you can, but managing and healing are 2 different things." Levi's voice carried the gentle authority of someone accustomed to dealing with stubborn patients. "Besides, if we're going to be partners in this fight, I need to know exactly what you're capable of." After a moment's hesitation, Sadie allowed him to help her move to a spot where the morning light streamed in more clearly. The extent of her injuries became apparent as Levi carefully examined the Damagino, just the obvious paralysis in her legs, but the deep bruising along her ribs, the infected cuts on her arms, and the way she held herself that spoke of internal injuries still healing. "How long since you've had a proper meal?" he asked, cleaning a particularly nasty gash on her shoulder. "Hard to say. Been living on what I could forage and some jerky I had in my saddlebags." Sadie winced as he applied whiskey to the wound. "Lost my horse in the first day after the ambush. Poor thing stepped in a prairie dog hole and broke her leg. Had to put her down. Couldn't. Didn't have the strength to draw my gun. And besides," she gestured toward the corner where her father's rifle lay in pieces, "that got damaged in the crash, and it's the only weapon I have." Levi picked up the broken rifle, examining it with the practiced eye of someone who'd maintained his own weapons for decades. The stock was cracked, the barrel was bent, and the firing mechanism was completely jammed with debris. It would take considerable skill and the right tools to make it functional again. "This was your father's?" "His hunting rifle. He taught me to shoot with it when I was 12. Sadie's voice carried a note of fierce pride mixed with grief. "I could put 5 shots in a playing card at 50 yards before my 13th birthday. Good skill to have." Levi set the rifle aside and continued tending to her wounds. "What else did your family business involve, besides banking?" "My father owned shares in a freight company, had investments in several mining claims, did some cattle trading on the side." Sadie's expression grew thoughtful. "Come to think of it, most of his business dealings involved moving money or goods through the territory. That's probably how he stumbled onto the corruption. He would have seen the patterns, noticed when things didn't add up. As Levi worked, he found himself drawing parallels between Sadie's situation and some of the cases he'd handled as a deputy. Territorial corruption was nothing new, but the scale of what she was describing, involving federal funds, railroad money, and Indian treaty payments, suggested something far larger than the usual small-town graft. "The men who attacked your stagecoach," he said. "You recognized 2 of them with Whitmore this morning. What about the others?" "There were 6 of them at Devil's Canyon. Jake was the leader, the one giving orders. The other one with Whitmore today was called Pete Hees, the one who shot Mrs. Henderson." Sadie's voice went flat and cold. "I'll never forget his face." "And the other 4? "Hired guns, most likely. The kind of men who follow orders and don't ask questions as long as the pay is good." She paused, thinking. "But Jake and Pete, they knew details about my father's business that they shouldn't have known. Someone had briefed them thoroughly." Levi finished cleaning her wounds and helped her into a more comfortable position against the hay bales. "Someone on the inside. Has to be. The question is how high up the corruption goes." Sadie pulled the leather pouch from beneath her shirt again, holding it like a talisman. "My father's records will tell us, but I haven't had the chance to study them properly since the attack. Maybe it's time we took a look." Sadie hesitated, then began working at the ties that held the pouch closed. "These documents, they're the only proof that exists of what my father discovered. If something happens to them—" "Nothing's going to happen to them," Levi said firmly. "But we need to understand what we're dealing with if we're going to fight it." The contents of the pouch were more extensive than Levi had expected. There were dozens of papers, bank records, correspondence, receipts, and what appeared to be a detailed ledger in careful handwriting. Sadie spread them out on a clean saddle blanket, organizing them with the precision of someone who understood their importance. "This is my father's writing," she explained, pointing to the ledger. "He was meticulous about keeping records. Every transaction, every irregularity, every suspicious pattern, it's all documented here." Levi studied the pages, his respect for Sadie's father growing with each entry. The man had been conducting his own investigation, tracking money flows and identifying discrepancies with the thoroughness of a professional detective. The picture that emerged was staggering in its scope. "Sweet Jesus," Levi breathed. "They've been stealing from everyone: the Railroad Development Fund, money earmarked for treaty payments to the tribes, even soldiers' pay intended for the territorial garrison." "Over $200,000 by my father's count," Sadie said. "And that's just what he was able to document. The real amount is probably much higher." Levi whistled low. $200,000 was more money than most people would see in several lifetimes. It was the kind of money that could buy judges, senators, maybe even territorial governors. No wonder they'd been willing to kill an entire stagecoach full of people to keep it secret. "Who else knew your father was investigating this?" "No one, as far as I know. He was careful to keep his suspicions to himself until he had enough evidence to act." Sadie's finger traced one of the entries in the ledger. "But someone found out anyway. Someone warned them that he was getting close to the truth." They spent the next hour going through the documents more carefully, and the picture that emerged was even more damaging than Levi had initially realized. The corruption wasn't just about stealing money, it was about a systematic effort to destabilize the territorial government, to create chaos that would benefit certain business interests while harming the ordinary people who depended on territorial services. "Look at this," Sadie said, pointing to a series of entries near the end of the ledger. Money that was supposed to go to tribal treaty payments was diverted to private accounts. "Do you know what happens when the government doesn't honor its treaty obligations?" Levi knew all too well. Broken treaties led to conflict, and conflict led to violence that usually fell hardest on innocent settlers and peaceful tribal members alike. They're trying to start a war, or at least create enough instability to justify bringing in federal troops, which would mean federal contracts for supplies, transportation, and reconstruction. Sadie's voice was grim. A lot of people would get rich off a territorial war, and a lot more would die for their profit. The implications were staggering. What had started as a case of financial corruption was actually a conspiracy that could lead to widespread bloodshed. And the only evidence that could stop it was sitting on a saddle blanket in a run-down barn, protected by a broken-down rancher and a paralyzed young woman. "We need to get this to someone who can act on it," Levi said. "The question is who? My father tried going through territorial channels, and look where it got him." Sadie began carefully folding the documents back into the pouch. "We need someone with federal authority, someone who can't be bought or intimidated." "Federal marshal?" "Maybe. But how do we know which federal officials are clean and which ones are part of the conspiracy?" Sadie secured the pouch beneath her shirt again. "For all we know, this corruption reaches all the way to Washington." It was a sobering thought. Levi had always believed in the essential decency of the law, had spent 8 years of his life serving it with pride and conviction. But he'd also seen enough corruption in small towns to know that badges and titles didn't automatically make men honest. "We'll figure that out later," he said. "Right now, our first priority is staying alive long enough to get the chance." They spent the rest of the morning making the barn as defensible as possible. Levi moved supplies and ammunition to strategic positions, created firing ports by loosening several boards, and set up a system of ropes and pulleys that would allow them to move quickly between different positions, despite Sadie's limited mobility. "You've done this before," Sadie observed, watching him work with professional efficiency. "More times than I care to remember. There was a period when the territorial legislature was trying to impose some unpopular taxes, and several ranchers decided they'd rather fight than pay. Spent 3 days holed up in a farmhouse with a fellow deputy while 20 angry cattlemen tried to convince us to see things their way. What happened? Eventually they got tired and went home. Turned out they were more interested in making a point than actually killing anyone. Levi tested the rope system he'd rigged, nodding with satisfaction as it worked smoothly. These men are different. They've already proven they're willing to kill for what they want. As they worked, Levi found himself studying Sadie with growing admiration. Despite her injuries, despite the trauma she'd endured, she remained focused and determined. More importantly, she had a sharp, tactical mind that complemented his own experience with defensive positions. "We need to think about supplies," she said, examining their limited resources. "If they decide to wait us out rather than assault directly, we could be in trouble." "Already thought of that." Levi gestured towards several hidden caches he'd established around the barn. "Water, food, Ammunition enough for at least a week if we're careful. And after that? After that, we'd better have figured out how to break this deadlock. Levi checked his pocket watch, noting that they'd already burned through most of the morning. They gave me until sunset to clear out. Figure they'll be back not long after dark, when they think they'll have the advantage. Will they? Levi considered the question seriously. Depends on how many men they bring and how smart they are about using them. Jake strikes me as someone who knows his business, but he's also the type who might get overconfident. If they think they're dealing with just a broken-down rancher and a crippled girl, they'll learn different, Sadie finished, her voice carrying a note of steel that reminded Levi why her attackers had found it necessary to kill 9 people just to get to her. As the afternoon wore on, they continued their preparations while getting to know each other better. Levi shared stories of his years as a deputy, of the cases that had shaped his understanding of justice and the criminals who had tested his resolve. Sadie talked about her family, about growing up in a household where integrity was valued more than profit, about the dreams that had died with her parents in a deliberately set fire. "What will you do when this is over?" Levi asked, as they shared a simple meal of beans and hardtack. "Assuming we survive. I haven't thought that far ahead." Sadie stared out through the barn doors at the rolling prairie beyond. "Everything I knew, everyone I love, it's all gone. I'm not sure what's left for someone like me." "Someone like you?" "A woman with a broken back and a price on her head." She managed a rueful smile. "Not exactly prime marriage material, and I'm not sure what other options are available." Levi was quiet for a moment, thinking about his own uncertain future, about the foreclosure notice in his pocket and the empty house where Martha's ghost still seemed to linger. "Maybe that's something we can figure out together," he said finally, "after we deal with the immediate problem of staying alive." For the first time since he'd known her, Sadie looked genuinely surprised. "You'd want that? After everything that's happened?" "I've spent the last 2 years convinced that my life was over, that everything worth having had already been taken from me." Levi met her eyes steadily. "Yesterday I was ready to hang myself in this barn rather than face another day. But here we are, and for the first time in a long time, I'm not looking forward to dying." The admission hung between them, honest and vulnerable, in a way that surprised them both. Before either could respond, the sound of distant hoofbeats drifted across the prairie, growing steadily closer. "Looks like our visitors are arriving early," Levi said, checking his weapons one final time. "How many?" Sadie asked, moving with practiced efficiency to her assigned position behind the hay bales. Levi peered through one of the gaps in the barn wall, counting riders silhouetted against the afternoon sky. "More than 3 this time. Looks like they decided to bring some friends to the party." As the sound of approaching horses grew louder, Levi found himself thinking about the rope that still hung from the crossbeam above them. It seemed like a lifetime ago that he'd stood beneath it with death in his heart and defeat in his soul. Now, facing overwhelming odds with a broken rifle and a woman who couldn't walk, he felt more alive than he had in years. Sometimes, he reflected, the best way to find a reason to live was to find something worth dying for. The riders stopped just beyond rifle range, 8 men silhouetted against the late afternoon sky. Levi counted them carefully, noting their positions and the way they held themselves in their saddles. Professional gunmen, every one of them, with the patient, predatory stillness of wolves waiting for the right moment to strike. "They're not in any hurry," Sadie observed from her position behind the hay bales. "That's not a good sign." Levi nodded grimly. Men in a hurry made mistakes, acted rashly, gave their opponents opportunities. These men were taking their time, studying the situation, planning their approach with the methodical care of experienced killers. "Can you make out any faces from here?" he asked. Sadie squinted through the gap in the barn wall. "Jake's there, on the bay horse, and Pete, the one who shot Mrs. Henderson. The others." She paused, her breath catching. "Sweet Mary, I think that's Cole Brennan." The name meant nothing to Levi, but the fear in Sadie's voice told him everything he needed to know. "Friend of yours?" "Bounty hunter. They say he's never brought anyone back alive, that he considers killing more efficient than capturing." Sadie's hand moved unconsciously to the leather pouch beneath her shirt. If they brought Brennan into this, they're not planning to take any prisoners. As if summoned by his name, one of the riders separated from the group and approached at a walking pace. Even at a distance, there was something distinctly menacing about the Mantha way. He sat his horse with casual confidence, the twin gun belts crossed over his chest, the black duster that flapped behind him like wings. He stopped well outside pistol range and called out in a voice that carried clearly across the open ground. "Levi Cade, we need to have ourselves a conversation." Levi moved to where he could respond without exposing himself. "I'm listening, Brennan." "Smart man, knowing my name, saves us some time on introductions." Brennan's laugh was like gravel in a bucket. "I'm here about the girl, Cade. The one that's supposed to be dead but ain't quite as dead as advertised. You hand her over peaceful-like, and you get to walk away from this with your skin intact." "Don't see any girl here," Levi called back. "Just me and my foreclosure notice." "Now that's disappointing. See, I was hoping we could handle this like civilized folks." Brennan shifted in his saddle, his hands moving to rest on his gun butts. "But if you want to play games, I'm happy to oblige. Just remember, when the shooting starts, that you had a chance to do this the easy way." "What guarantee do I have that you'll honor your word?" Levi asked, playing for time while he studied the positions of the other riders. "You don't, but I'll give you my professional word that if you cooperate, your death will be quick and painless. That's more consideration than most folks in my line of work would offer." The casual mention of death was clearly intended to intimidate, but Levi had faced down too many dangerous men to be rattled by threats. "Generous of you, but I think I'll pass on the offer." "Your choice." Brennan wheeled his horse around and rode back to rejoin the others. Within moments, the group had spread out in a wide semicircle around the barn, positioning themselves to cover all possible escape routes. "They're setting up for a siege," Sadie said quietly. "Looks that way." Levi checked his weapons one more time, then settled in to wait. "Question is whether they'll try to starve us out or get impatient and come at us direct." They didn't have to wait long for an answer. As the sun touched the horizon, painting the prairie in shades of gold and crimson, two of the riders dismounted and began working their way closer to the barn on foot. They moved with the practiced stealth of men accustomed to violence, using every scrap of cover available as they advanced. "There," Sadie whispered, pointing to a slight movement near the old water trough, "and another one behind the woodpile." Levi had already spotted both men, along with a third who was using the shadow of the house to mask his approach. "They're trying to get close enough to rush us. Standard tactic when you've got superior numbers. What do? We remind them that this isn't going to be as easy as they think." Levi sighted carefully through one of the gaps in the barn wall, waiting for the man behind the woodpile to expose himself. When the gunman finally made his move, darting from one piece of cover to another, Levi's shot took him squarely in the chest. The sound of the gunshot echoed across the prairie like thunder, and the man dropped without a sound. The other two attackers immediately dove for cover, but their positions were now known, their element of surprise lost. "One down," Levi said quietly, already shifting to a different firing position as return shots began to splinter the wood around his previous location. The battle had begun in earnest now, with muzzle flashes lighting up the gathering dusk as the gunmen opened fire on the barn. But they were shooting blind, trying to hit targets they couldn't see, while Levi had the advantage of prepared positions and intimate knowledge of his own property. "Behind you," Sadie called out sharply. Levi spun to see a figure climbing through one of the rear windows of the barn, silhouetted against the evening sky. His shot was hasty but true, and the intruder tumbled backward with a scream that was cut short by the sound of his body hitting the ground. "Two down," Sadie said grimly, "but they'll learn from this. Next time they won't be so careless." She was right. The gunfire slackened, then stopped altogether as the attackers regrouped and reconsidered their approach. In the sudden silence, Levi could hear the whispered voices of men conferring, planning their next move. "They'll wait for full dark now," he said. "Try to get close enough to set the barn on fire, or rush us from multiple directions at once. How long do we have? Levi glanced at the western horizon, where the last traces of daylight were fading into purple darkness. Maybe an hour before the moon rises. After that, we'll have enough light to see them coming, but they'll have enough darkness to move around more freely. As if to punctuate his words, a voice called out from the darkness, not Brennan this time, but Jake, the scarred gunman who'd ridden with Whitmore that morning. Getting lonely in there, Cade? We can keep this up all night if you want. Got plenty of ammunition and nothing but time. Levi didn't respond, knowing that any reply would just give away his position. Instead, he used the lull in the fighting to check on Sadie, who had positioned herself where she could watch the barn's blind spots and provide covering fire if needed. "How are you holding up?" he asked quietly. "Better than I expected." She managed a tight smile. "Funny thing about having people try to kill you tends to focus the mind wonderfully." Despite everything, Levi found himself grinning. There was something infectious about Sadie's courage, something that reminded him of why he'd chosen to wear a badge all those years ago. Some people were worth protecting, worth fighting for, worth risking everything to keep safe. "There's something I need to tell you," Sadie said suddenly, her voice taking on a more serious tone. "About the photograph in my father's papers." "What about it?" She fumbled in the leather pouch, withdrawing a small, cracked daguerreotype that she'd mentioned earlier but hadn't shown him. Even in the dim light filtering through the barn, Levi could make out the figures of a man, woman, and young boy standing in front of what appeared to be a bank building. "That's my family," Sadie said. "But look at the background, at the man standing in the doorway of the bank." Levi squinted at the image, trying to make out details in the damaged photograph. When he finally recognized the figure, his blood ran cold. "That's Whitmore. Clarence Whitmore, president of the Territorial Bank, the same man who foreclosed on your ranch this morning." Sadie's voice was steady, but Levi could hear the underlying tension. "My father took this photograph 6 months ago, when Whitmore first approached him about some irregular transactions. He was documenting everything, even social meetings." The implications hit Levi like a physical blow. "Whitmore knew your father was investigating him." "More than that. He was probably feeding my father information, stringing him along, making him think he was uncovering the corruption on his own." Sadie carefully tucked the photograph back into the pouch. "My father wasn't killed because he discovered the conspiracy. He was killed because he'd served his purpose and become a liability. And your ranch foreclosure wasn't about missed payments," Levi said, understanding dawning. "It was about clearing the area, making sure there were no witnesses when they came looking for you." "Which means they've been planning this for months, maybe longer." Sadie shifted position, wincing as her injuries reminded her of their limitations. "We're not just fighting a group of hired killers, Levi. We're fighting an organization that has resources, connections, and time to plan." Before Levi could respond, the sound of breaking glass came from the direction of the house, followed by the distinctive whoosh of flames catching hold. Orange light began to flicker through the windows of his home, growing brighter by the moment. "They're burning the house," Sadie said unnecessarily. "Smart move. Eliminates one possible hiding spot and gives them more light to work with." Levi watched his home, the place where he'd lived with Martha, where they'd planned their future together, go up in flames. Strangely, he felt no grief at the sight. The house had been empty since Martha died, just another reminder of everything he'd lost. Now it was serving a purpose, revealing the true nature of the men they were fighting. "I'm sorry," Sadie said softly. "Don't be. That stopped being a home 2 years ago. Now it's just wood and nails." Levi returned his attention to the dark prairie beyond the barn. Besides, they just gave away their position. Watch the shadows. Sure enough, the firelight from the burning house was casting moving shadows across the ground, revealing the positions of men who thought they were hidden. Levi counted at least 4 more gunmen, all moving to surround the barn now that they had enough light to coordinate their movements. "They're going to rush us," he said. "All at once, from multiple directions. It's what I'd do in their position." "What's our best chance?" Levi considered the question seriously. With 8 men originally and 2 down, they were facing 6 experienced killers in a coordinated assault. The odds were not good, but they weren't impossible either. "We make them pay for every foot of ground," he said finally. "Make it cost them more than they're willing to spend. And if that's not enough?" Levi looked at her steadily, seeing not the broken young woman who'd fallen from his hayloft, but a partner who understood what they were facing and was prepared to face it with courage. "Then we make sure that photograph and those documents survive, even if we don't." Sadie nodded, understanding. They were fighting for more than their own lives now. They were fighting for justice, for the truth, for the memory of 9 innocent people who died in a canyon and a family who'd burned in their own home. The sound of running feet on hard ground announced the beginning of the final assault. Levi took a deep breath, settled his aim, and prepared to show Brennan and his men what happened when they threatened the wrong, broken-down rancher and his unlikely partner. The real battle was about to begin. The assault came from 3 directions at once, just as Levi had predicted. Dark figures rushed through the firelight cast by the burning house, their guns blazing as they charged toward the barn with the coordinated precision of professional killers. But as the first wave of attackers closed the distance, Levi felt something he hadn't experienced in years: the cold, focused calm of a lawman facing down criminals who thought they were above justice. His first shot dropped the lead man in the center group, a clean hit that sent the gunman tumbling forward into the dirt. Sadie's voice called out positions and warnings from her vantage point, her tactical mind proving as valuable as any weapon in their limited arsenal. "2 more coming around the left side," she called. "They're using the water trough for cover." Levi shifted position, using the rope system he'd rigged to move quickly between firing ports without exposing himself to return fire. The barn had become a fortress, and he was defending it with the methodical efficiency of someone who understood that survival meant making every shot count. But as the battle raged, something unexpected happened. The sound of distant gunfire began to echo from beyond the ridge, not the controlled volleys of Brennan's men, but the chaotic crackling of a larger engagement. Someone else had arrived at the party, and they weren't on the same side as the bounty hunters. "What in hell?" Jake's voice carried clearly across the battlefield, confusion and anger evident in his tone. The distraction was all Levi needed. As the remaining attackers turned to face this new threat, he managed to take down another gunman with a well-placed shot. But the reprieve was temporary, and the identity of their unexpected allies remained a mystery. That's when Levi made a decision that would change everything. Moving to the corner of the barn where he'd hidden his most precious possessions years ago, he pried loose a board that concealed a small metal box. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, was his old deputy sheriff's badge, tarnished, with age but still bearing the authority he'd once carried with pride. "What are you doing?" Sadie asked, watching him pin the badge to his shirt. "Remembering who I used to be," Levi replied, "before grief and failure made me forget." The badge felt heavier than he remembered, not from its physical weight but from the responsibility it represented. For 8 years, it had been more than a piece of metal. It had been a symbol of his commitment to protecting the innocent and upholding justice. He'd put it away when he married Martha, thinking his days of law enforcement were behind him. Now, facing the kind of corruption that his younger self would never have tolerated, he understood that some duties transcended retirement. "You were a deputy," Sadie said, understanding dawning in her eyes. "I was, and maybe it's time I started acting like one again." Levi checked his weapons, his movements taking on the practiced efficiency of a lawman preparing for duty. "These men aren't just trying to kill us, Sadie. They're trying to destroy evidence of crimes that could affect thousands of innocent people. As a sworn officer of the law, I can't let that happen." The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. Where moments before there had been a broken-down rancher fighting for survival, now there stood a deputy sheriff with a job to do. The change wasn't just in Levi's posture or his movements, it was in his entire approach to the situation. This wasn't just about staying alive anymore, it was about upholding justice. The gunfire outside has stopped, Sadie observed. Either our mysterious allies won, or they didn't. Before Levi could respond, a new voice called out from the darkness, not Jake or Brennan, but someone with the crisp authority of military training. "This is Captain Marcus Webb, United States Army. You men are surrounded and under arrest for crimes against the territorial government." The effect on the remaining attackers was immediate and dramatic. Caught between the barn they'd been assaulting and what sounded like federal troops, Brennan's men found themselves in an untenable position. Some tried to surrender, others attempted to shoot their way out. None of them succeeded. When the gunfire finally stopped and the dust settled, 6 men lay dead in the dirt around Levi's barn, while 2 more had been taken prisoner by the soldiers who'd arrived at the most opportune moment possible. "Mr. Cade," Captain Webb called out, "we have information that you may be harboring a witness to federal crimes. We need to speak with you." Levi looked at Sadie, seeing his own uncertainty reflected in her eyes. They'd survived the immediate threat, but now they faced a new dilemma. Could they trust these federal soldiers? Were they legitimate law enforcement or part of the same corruption that had killed Sadie's family? "How do we know you're really Army?" Levi called back, his hand still resting on his gun. "Because we've been tracking the same corruption that got Miss Lane's family killed," Webb replied. "We have federal warrants for Clarence Whitmore, Cole Brennan, and 6 other men involved in the theft of government funds." It was the mention of specific names that convinced Levi to trust, at least tentatively. He emerged from the barn slowly, his badge catching the firelight from his burning house, his hands visible but ready to draw if necessary. Captain Webb was a tall, lean man with graying temples and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. Behind him stood 12 soldiers in federal blue, their weapons lowered but ready. More importantly, their faces showed the discipline and professionalism of legitimate military men, not the casual brutality of hired killers. "Deputy Cade," Webb said, noting the badge. "We weren't aware you were still active law enforcement." "Wasn't until tonight," Levi replied honestly. "But sometimes circumstances call a man back to duty." "Indeed they do." Webb's gaze moved past Levi to where Sadie was carefully making her way out of the barn, supported by a makeshift crutch. "Miss Lane, I presume. We've been looking for you for quite some time." "Looking for me or looking to kill me?" Sadie asked, her voice carrying the wariness of someone who'd learned not to trust easily. "Looking to protect you and secure the evidence you're carrying," Webb replied. "We've been investigating the same corruption your father discovered, but we needed a witness and documentation to make our case. When we learned you'd survived the stagecoach attack, we've been racing to find you before Whitmore's people could eliminate the threat you represent." Sadie studied the captain for a long moment, then slowly reached for the leather pouch beneath her shirt. "You know about the documents?" "We know your father was documenting irregularities in territorial funds. We know he was murdered for it, along with your family. And we know that what you're carrying could bring down a conspiracy that reaches from here to Washington." Webb's voice was grave. "What we didn't know was whether you'd survived to tell the tale." "How did you find us?" Levi asked. "We've been tracking Brennan's men for days. When they converged on this location, we knew we'd found what we were looking for." Webb gestured toward the bodies scattered around the barn. "We arrived just in time, it seems." As if to emphasize his words, the sound of approaching horses announced the arrival of more federal troops. Soon, the area around Levi's barn was filled with soldiers, and what remained of Brennan's gang was being processed as prisoners. "What happens now?" Sadie asked. "Now we take your evidence and your testimony, and we use them to clean up this mess," Webb replied. "But I should warn you, this investigation is going to reach some very high places. There are going to be people who don't want the truth to come out. People with enough power to make your lives difficult even after the main perpetrators are arrested." Levi understood the implications. Justice was a fine thing, but it often came with a price that extended far beyond the courtroom. "What kind of protection are you offering?" "Full federal protection until the trials are concluded. New identities afterward, if necessary." The government takes a dim view of people who steal federal funds and murder witnesses. Webb's expression was grim. We'll see that justice is done, but it won't be easy or quick. As the night wore on, Levi found himself providing detailed statements about the events of the past day, while Sadie carefully went through her father's documents with federal investigators. The scope of the corruption was even larger than they'd initially believed, involving not just territorial officials, but federal appointees, railroad executives, and a network of criminals that stretched across multiple states. "Your testimony is going to be crucial," Webb told Sadie as dawn began to break over the prairie. "Without it, we have documents, but no one to authenticate them or explain their significance." "And my ranch?" Levi asked, looking at the smoldering ruins of his house and the foreclosure notice that still sat in his pocket. The foreclosure was part of the conspiracy and attempt to clear the area before they moved against Miss Lane. "It will be reversed, and you'll receive compensation for your losses." Webb smiled for the first time since arriving. "The federal government doesn't forget those who serve justice," Deputy Cade. As the sun climbed higher, painting the Montana sky in shades of gold and rose, Levi found himself standing next to Sadie as federal troops processed the scene and prepared to transport them to safety. His house was gone, his barn was shot full of holes, and his cattle were long since sold. But for the first time in 2 years, he felt like he had a future worth pursuing. "So what happens to us?" Sadie asked quietly. "After the trials, after the justice is done, what then?" Levi looked at her, seeing not the broken young woman who'd fallen from his hayloft, but a partner who'd helped him remember who he really was. The badge on his chest caught the morning light, no longer tarnished, but gleaming with renewed purpose. "I reckon that depends on whether you'd be interested in staying partners," he said. "Turns out this territory's going to need some honest lawmen once we clean out the corruption. And I could use someone with your tactical mind watching my back." Sadie's smile was like sunrise after the longest night of his life. "I thought you'd never ask, Deputy Cade." As they walked toward the federal wagon that would take them to safety and justice, Levi found himself thinking about the rope that still hung from his barn's crossbeam. Less than 24 hours ago, it had represented the end of everything he cared about. Now it seemed like nothing more than a reminder of how quickly life could change, how a single moment of grace could transform despair into hope, surrender into purpose. He had his badge back. He had a partner who understood the weight of justice, and he had a future that suddenly seemed worth fighting for. Sometimes, he reflected, the best way to find yourself was to help someone else find their way home. 3 days later, in the secure confines of the federal courthouse in Helena, Sadie finally had the opportunity to examine her father's complete records under proper lighting and with the assistance of federal investigators. What she discovered in the leather-bound journal hidden within her pouch made even the hardened federal agents take notice. "This isn't just about stolen money," she explained to Captain Webb and Levi as they huddled around a table covered with documents. "My father wasn't just tracking financial irregularities, he was documenting a systematic plan to destabilize the entire territorial government." The journal was a masterpiece of careful observation and meticulous record-keeping. Written in her father's precise handwriting, it detailed not just the theft of federal funds, but the broader conspiracy behind it. Page after page revealed a network of corruption that went far beyond simple embezzlement. "Look at this entry from 3 months ago," Sadie said, pointing to a passage near the middle of the journal. "My father writes about a meeting between Whitmore and territorial officials, where they discussed engineering conflicts with local tribes to justify increased federal military presence." Captain Webb leaned closer, his expression growing darker as he read. They were planning to start a war. Not just planning, implementing. Sadie turned to another page, where her father had documented weapons, shipments, and communication intercepts. They were selling rifles to hostile bands, while simultaneously cutting off treaty payments to peaceful tribes. The idea was to create enough instability to justify bringing in federal troops, which would mean massive government contracts for supplies, transportation, and reconstruction. Levi felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Montana weather. How many people would have died in their manufactured war? Hundreds, maybe thousands, Webb replied grimly. Settlers, soldiers, tribal members, anyone who got caught in the crossfire. He studied the journal more carefully. This is evidence of conspiracy to commit treason, not just theft. It gets worse, Sadie said, turning to the final entries in her father's journal. He discovered that the plan included assassinating the territorial governor and blaming it on hostile tribes. They were going to use his murder to justify declaring martial law and bringing in federal administrators who were part of their network. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. What had started as a case of financial corruption was actually a plot to overthrow the legitimate territorial government and replace it with a shadow administration that would serve the interests of a handful of wealthy criminals. Your father was incredibly brave, Webb said quietly. He must have known how dangerous this information was. He knew. Sadie's voice was steady, but Levi could see the pain in her eyes. That's why he was so careful about documentation, why he kept multiple copies of everything hidden in different locations. He knew they would try to destroy the evidence along with anyone who could testify about it. Multiple copies? Levi asked. Sadie nodded, reaching into the leather pouch to withdraw a small key. My father was a banker, he understood the importance of securing valuable assets. This key opens a safety deposit box in the Miners' Bank in Butte. He told me about it just before I left for Helena, said it contained insurance in case anything happened to him. Captain Webb took the key, examining it carefully. We'll need to retrieve those documents as soon as possible. If Whitmore's people know about the safety deposit box. They might, Sadie admitted. But they'd need authorization from me or my father to access it, and the bank president, Mr. Holstead, was one of the few men my father trusted completely. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a federal marshal, a stern-faced man named Coleman, who'd been coordinating the broader investigation. His expression was grave as he approached their table. We have a problem, he announced without preamble. Clarence Whitmore has disappeared. The words hit the room like a physical blow. Levi felt his hand move instinctively toward his gun, even though they were in the secure confines of a federal courthouse. What do you mean, disappeared? Webb demanded. He left Helena yesterday morning, supposedly on routine bank business, never arrived at his stated destination, and no one's seen him since. Coleman's voice was tight with frustration. We had surveillance on him, but somehow he managed to slip away. Inside help? Levi asked. Has to be. There are too many people involved in this conspiracy for us to be sure. We've identified them all. Coleman looked directly at Sadie. Which means you're still in danger, Miss Lane. As long as Whitmore is free and those documents exist, you're a threat he can't afford to leave alive. Sadie's hand moved unconsciously to the leather pouch, a gesture that had become second nature over the past few days. What about the safety deposit box in Butte? We're sending a team there immediately, but it's a 2-day ride under the best conditions. Coleman's expression was grim. If Whitmore knows about it and gets there first, then we lose the only backup copy of evidence that could bring down this entire conspiracy, Webb finished. The implications hung heavy in the room. Without the documents in her father's journal and the backup copies in Butte, the federal case would rely entirely on Sadie's testimony that would be worthless if Whitmore managed to eliminate her before the trials began. I want to go to Butte, Sadie said suddenly. Absolutely not, Webb replied immediately. It's too dangerous. We can't risk. You can't risk losing the evidence, Sadie interrupted. But I'm the only one who knows exactly what my father hid in that box, the only one who can authenticate the documents and explain their significance. If your team retrieves the wrong materials or misses something crucial, she was right, and everyone in the room knew it. The documents were valuable, but without someone who understood their context and meaning, they might not be enough to build a case that would reach all the way to Washington. I'll go with her, Levi said, earning surprised looks from the federal officials. Deputy Cade, with all due respect, you're not equipped for this kind of operation, Coleman said diplomatically. Maybe not, but I know this territory better than your federal agents, and I've got a personal stake in keeping Miss Lane alive. Levi's hand touched the badge on his chest, drawing strength from its familiar weight. Besides, Whitmore made this personal when he foreclosed on my ranch as part of his conspiracy. I owe him some payback. Webb studied them both for a long moment, clearly weighing the risks against the potential benefits. It would be a small team, moving fast and staying ahead of any pursuit. But if Whitmore has men watching the roads to Butte, then we don't take the roads, Levi said. I know trails through the mountains that most people have forgotten about. It'll be rough going, especially for someone in Miss Lane's condition, but it might be our best chance of getting there undetected. And if we encounter Whitmore's men anyway? Webb asked. Levi's smile was cold as winter wind. Then they'll learn that some old deputies still remember how to handle themselves in a fight. The plan that emerged from their discussion was risky but potentially effective. Levi and Sadie would travel to Butte using mountain trails that would be difficult for large groups to follow, while federal troops created a diversion by taking the main roads and making themselves visible. If Whitmore was watching for them, he'd follow the obvious trail and miss the real prize. It's dangerous, Webb warned as they finalized the details. If something goes wrong, if you're discovered or attacked, we might not be able to reach you in time to help. I understand the risks, Sadie said firmly, but those documents are worth more than my life. If we can get them safely into federal hands, we can prevent a war and see justice done for my family. As they prepared for the journey, Levi found himself thinking about the badge he wore and the oath he'd taken 8 years ago to protect and serve. This wasn't exactly what he'd envisioned when he'd pinned on that piece of metal, but sometimes duty took unexpected forms. You sure about this? He asked Sadie as they checked their supplies and weapons. Once we leave Helena, we're on our own until we reach Butte. I've been on my own since my family died, she replied quietly. At least now I have a partner who knows how to handle himself in a fight. The compliment warmed him more than it should have. Over the past few days, he'd begun to understand that his growing feelings for Sadie went beyond simple protectiveness or shared danger. There was something about her courage, her determination to see justice done despite the personal cost, that reminded him of why he'd chosen to be a lawman in the first place. We'll get through this, he said, meaning it. Your father's evidence will be safe, Whitmore will face justice, and you'll finally be able to start rebuilding your life. What about you? Sadie asked. What will you do when this is all over? Levi considered the question seriously. His ranch was gone, his house was burned, and his cattle were long since sold. But for the first time in 2 years, those losses didn't feel like endings, they felt like opportunities for new beginnings. I reckon that depends on whether you'd be interested in having a partner in whatever comes next, he said. This territory is going to need honest lawmen once we clean out the corruption, and I could use someone with your tactical mind and steady nerves. Sadie's smile was answer enough. As they prepared to leave Helena under cover of darkness, traveling toward an uncertain confrontation with the men who'd murdered her family, Levi found himself thinking about the rope that still hung in his barn back home. It seemed like a lifetime ago that he'd stood beneath it with death in his heart and defeat in his soul. Now, riding toward danger with a woman who'd taught him to hope again, he understood that sometimes the end of one story was just the beginning of another. And this story, he was determined, would have a better ending than the one he'd almost written for himself in a barn at Bitter Creek. The mountain trail to Butte was treacherous, even under the best of circumstances, and Sadie's condition made the journey particularly challenging. But they'd covered nearly 30 miles in 2 days, staying well ahead of any pursuit while navigating the high country passes that Levi remembered from his younger days as a deputy. They'd stopped to rest at an abandoned mining camp when Levi spotted the first wanted poster. It was nailed to a tree near what had once been the camp's main street, the paper still crisp and new, despite the mountain weather. Levi's own face stared back at him from the crude illustration, along with details that made his blood run cold. Wanted for murder and bank robbery, the poster proclaimed in bold letters. Levy Cade, former deputy, 1, 0 reward dead or alive. Sadie read over his shoulder, her intake of breath sharp in the thin mountain air. "They're framing you." "Looks that way." Levi studied the poster more carefully, noting the official territorial seal and the signature at the bottom. "Says here I robbed the territorial bank in Helena 3 days ago and killed 2 guards in the process. 3 days ago we were fighting for our lives in your barn," Sadie said angrily. "Anyone who was there can testify." "Anyone who was there is either dead or works for the federal government," Levi interrupted grimly. "And federal testimony might not carry much weight if this gets to a territorial court first." The implications were staggering. By framing Levi for a bank robbery, Whitmore's people had accomplished several things at once. They'd discredited his testimony, given local law enforcement a reason to hunt him down, and created a narrative that would explain his death if they managed to kill him before he could reach federal protection. "It's connected to your family's case," Levi realized. "The bank robbery they're blaming me for, I'll bet it involved stealing or destroying records that could have supported your father's investigation." Sadie nodded slowly. "My father kept some of his preliminary notes in a safety deposit box at the Helena Bank. If they robbed the bank and destroyed those records, then they eliminated evidence while simultaneously creating a reason to hunt down the man protecting their primary witness." Levi crumpled the wanted poster, his anger growing with each passing moment. "Whitmore's smarter than I gave him credit for. What does this mean for us?" Levi looked around the abandoned mining camp, noting the multiple trails that led away from the site in different directions. They were still a day's ride from Butte, traveling through country where a $1,000 bounty would make them targets for every desperate man with a gun. "It means we need to be more careful," he said finally, "and it means we need to get to that safety deposit box before Whitmore's people figure out we're not taking the main roads." They resumed their journey with increased urgency, pushing harder despite the toll the rough travel was taking on Sadie. But as they crested a ridge overlooking the valley that led to Butte, Levi's worst fears were confirmed. "Look there," he said, pointing to a line of riders moving along the main road below them. At least a dozen men, all headed toward town. Sadie squinted against the afternoon sun, trying to make out details. "Can you tell who they are?" "Too far to be sure, but they're riding like men with purpose." Levi studied the terrain, calculating distances and timing. "If they're Whitmore's people, they'll reach Butte several hours before we do. Then we need to find another way in." Already thinking about that, Levi pointed to a cluster of buildings on the outskirts of town. "That's the old smelter district, been mostly abandoned since the big mine played out last year. If we can get there after dark, we might be able to slip into town without being seen." It was risky, but their options were limited. As they worked their way down the mountainside, staying well clear of the main roads, Levi found himself thinking about the wanted poster and what it meant for their mission. Even if they managed to retrieve the documents from the safety deposit box, his credibility as a witness was now compromised. A wanted man's testimony wouldn't carry much weight in any court. "You're thinking about the poster," Sadie observed, as they navigated a particularly treacherous section of trail. "Hard not to. They've been planning this for longer than we realized." Levi helped her negotiate a fallen log that blocked their path. "The timing's too perfect. They framed me for robbery and murder, just as we're trying to secure evidence that could bring them down. Which means someone's been feeding them information about our movements." The thought had occurred to Levi as well, and it was deeply troubling. The federal investigation was supposed to be secure, but someone had known enough about their plans to arrange the bank robbery frame-up with perfect timing. "Could be someone in the federal marshal's office," he said reluctantly, "or someone with access to Captain Webb's communications. Or someone who's been watching us since we left Helena." Sadie's voice was grim. "We might not be as alone out here as we think." As if summoned by her words, the sound of distant gunfire echoed across the valley below them. Multiple weapons, firing in a sustained engagement that suggested a serious battle was taking place in or near Butte. "Federal troops?" Levi wondered aloud. "Or Whitmore's people eliminating witnesses at the bank?" Sadie's face was pale with worry. "If they've already gotten to the safety deposit box, then we'll improvise." Levi checked his weapons, ensuring they were ready for immediate use. But first, we need to get close enough to see what's happening. They continued their descent as the gunfire intensified, then gradually died away. By the time they reached the outskirts of the abandoned smelter district, the valley had fallen ominously quiet. Smoke was rising from the direction of the main business district, and the streets seemed unnaturally empty for early evening. "Something's wrong," Sadie said quietly. Levi nodded, feeling the familiar tension that came with approaching danger. They were close to their objective, but the situation in Butte had clearly deteriorated beyond their expectations. "We stick to the plan," he said. "Get to the bank, secure the documents, and get out. Whatever's happening here, we can't let it stop us from completing the mission." As they worked their way through the maze of abandoned buildings and rusted mining equipment, Levi caught glimpses of the main street through gaps in the structures. What he saw confirmed his worst fears: armed men patrolling in organized groups, bodies lying in the street, and the unmistakable signs of a town under siege. "They've taken over," Sadie breathed. "Whitmore's people have taken control of the entire town." "Looks that way." Levi studied the patrol patterns, looking for weaknesses they could exploit. "Question is whether they've gotten to the bank yet." The miners' bank sat in the middle of the business district, a substantial brick building that would normally have been well protected. But from their vantage point, Levi could see that several windows were broken and the front door was standing open. "We're too late," Sadie said, despair evident in her voice. "Maybe, but your father was a careful man. He might have anticipated this." Levi squeezed her shoulder gently. "We need to get inside and see what's left." Getting to the bank required crossing 2 blocks of open ground while avoiding the armed patrols that were systematically searching every building. It was dangerous work that reminded Levi of his army days, when moving unseen through hostile territory had been a matter of life and death. They made it to the bank's rear entrance just as a patrol rounded the corner of the building. Levi pressed Sadie against the wall, shielding her with his body as booted feet passed within inches of their hiding spot. When the patrol moved on, he carefully tried the back door. It was unlocked, which was either a stroke of luck or a very bad sign. The interior of the bank was a shambles. Desks had been overturned, papers scattered everywhere, and the massive safe in the corner stood open and empty. But as Levi surveyed the destruction, he noticed something the looters had missed: a smaller safe, built into the floor beneath the bank president's desk, its door still sealed. "The safety deposit boxes," Sadie whispered, pointing to a section of the wall that had been blown open with explosives. "They got to them." Levi examined the destroyed vault, noting that most of the individual boxes had been torn open and their contents scattered. But as he searched through the debris, his fingers encountered something unexpected: a small metal object that had been hidden beneath the wreckage. It was another key, smaller than the one Sadie carried, attached to a piece of paper with her father's handwriting. "For my daughter, if the worst should happen. The real insurance is where we used to count the pennies." "Where you used to count the pennies?" Levi asked, showing Sadie the note. Her eyes widened with understanding. "When I was little, my father used to let me help him count the day's receipts. We'd sit at his desk and sort the coins into piles." She looked at the smaller safe built into the floor. He must have had a private arrangement with the bank president. The key fit perfectly, and the safe opened to reveal not just documents, but something far more valuable: a complete duplicate of her father's investigation, along with additional evidence that hadn't been in the journal she carried. "There's more," Sadie said, her voice filled with awe as she examined the contents. Letters, photographs, even recorded statements from other witnesses. My father was building a case that could reach all the way to Washington. But their moment of triumph was short-lived. The sound of approaching voices from the front of the bank announced that they were no longer alone. "Check everything again," a familiar voice commanded. "Whitmore wants to be sure we didn't miss anything." It was Jake, the scarred gunman, who should have been dead in the dirt outside Levi's barn. Somehow he'd survived the federal assault and made his way to Butte ahead of them. "We need to go," Levi whispered, helping Sadie gather the documents. "Now." But as they moved toward the rear exit, the sound of breaking glass from that direction told them their escape route had been cut off. They were trapped in the bank with hostile forces closing in from both directions, and the evidence that could bring down Whitmore's entire conspiracy was once again in mortal danger. Levi checked his ammunition and prepared for what might be their final fight. At least this time, he thought grimly, they'd have the satisfaction of knowing exactly what they were dying for. The sound of Jake's voice grew closer as his men spread through the bank, systematically searching every corner. Levi and Sadie had taken refuge behind the massive oak desk where the hidden safe had been concealed, but it was only a matter of minutes before they'd be discovered. The documents they'd recovered were safely tucked into Sadie's leather pouch, but without a way out of the bank, that evidence would die with them. There, Jake's voice carried clearly across the ruined interior. Blood on the floor near the back door. Someone's been here recently. Levi silently cursed himself for not noticing that one of Sadie's wounds had reopened during their difficult journey. The small trail of blood would lead Jake's men directly to their hiding spot. But as the footsteps approached their position, Sadie suddenly grabbed Levi's arm and pointed upward. Above them, a narrow staircase led to what appeared to be a storage lofter space that might not be visible from the main floor. Moving with desperate quiet, Levi helped Sadie climb the steep stairs, praying that her injuries wouldn't cause her to make noise that would give away their position. Each step seemed to echo in the silence, but somehow they reached the loft just as Jake's men rounded the desk below. The loft was cramped and dusty, filled with old bank records and forgotten furniture. But it also contained something unexpected. A small window that overlooked the alley behind the bank, and more importantly, a coil of rope that had once been used to hoist heavy items to the upper level. "Can you manage a rope descent?" Levi whispered. Sadie looked at the window, calculating the distance to the ground. "With my legs the way they are? Not easily, but I can try." Before Levi could respond, the sound of splintering wood from below announced that Jake's men had found the hidden safe. Their voices carried clearly through the floorboards. "Empty, but it's been opened recently, the lock still warm." Jake's voice was filled with cold anger. "They were here. Search every inch of this place." "What about upstairs?" another voice asked. "Tear it apart." Time had run out. Levi secured one end of the rope to a heavy beam and prepared to lower Sadie through the window. But as he worked, something caught his eye, a glint of metal from among the old papers scattered around the loft. It was a small silver locket, partially hidden beneath a stack of ledgers, the kind of locket Martha used to wear, the kind she'd been buried with 2 years ago. But this locket was different, older, and when Levi opened it, he found something that made his heart stop. Inside was a miniature photograph of himself in his deputy's uniform, along with a folded piece of paper that bore his name in Martha's careful handwriting. But it wasn't the photograph that shocked him, it was the document hidden behind it. "Levi," Sadie's voice was urgent. "We need to go. Now." But Levi was staring at the paper in his hands, unable to believe what he was reading. It was a statement, written in Martha's hand, and witnessed by the bank president, detailing conversations she'd overheard between Clarence Whitmore and territorial officials. Conversations about framing her husband for crimes he hadn't committed, about using his reputation as a lawman to discredit federal investigations. "She knew," he breathed. "Martha knew about the conspiracy." The document was dated just 3 days before Martha's death, the death that Levi had always believed was caused by fever, but which suddenly took on a far more sinister cast. "They killed her," he said, the words coming out flat and emotionless as the full implications hit him. "She was investigating them, and they killed her for it." Sadie's eyes widened as she understood what he was reading. "Levi, I'm so sorry, but we have to move. They're coming up the stairs." The sound of heavy boots on the wooden steps snapped Levi back to the immediate danger. But the rage that filled him now was different from anything he'd ever experienced, cold, focused, and absolutely lethal. The men who'd destroyed Sadie's family had also murdered his wife, had poisoned her slowly and carefully to make it look like natural causes. "Get ready to go down that rope," he said quietly. "I'll be right behind you." But as Sadie positioned herself at the window, the trapdoor to the loft burst open and Jake's scarred face appeared, his gun already drawn. For a moment, the three of them froze in a tableau of mutual recognition and deadly intent. "Well, well," Jake said, his voice filled with vicious satisfaction. "The famous Deputy Cade and his crippled girlfriend. Whitmore's going to be so pleased." "Jake," Levi replied calmly, his own gun appearing in his hand with the fluid motion of a man who'd been practicing the draw for 30 years. "You should have stayed dead." The gunfight that followed was brief but vicious. Jake was fast, but Levi was faster, and his first shot took the gunman in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his weapon clattering across the floor. But Jake wasn't alone, and the sound of gunfire brought his men charging up the stairs. "Go!" Levi shouted to Sadie as he took cover behind an overturned desk. "Get those documents to safety." Sadie hesitated for a moment, torn between escape and loyalty to the man who'd saved her life. But the sound of more gunmen reaching the loft made the decision for her. She grabbed the rope and disappeared through the window, just as Jake's reinforcements burst through the trapdoor. Levi found himself facing 4 armed men in a confined space, with limited cover and no way out. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a death sentence. But the discovery of Martha's locket had changed something fundamental in his approach to violence. These weren't just criminals anymore, they were the men who'd murdered his wife. His first shot dropped the lead gunman before the man could clear the trapdoor. His second wounded another badly enough to take him out of the fight. But the remaining 2 had found cover and were returning fire with deadly accuracy, and Levi's position was becoming untenable. That's when he heard the sound that changed everything, the distant but unmistakable report of a rifle from the alley below. Someone was providing covering fire from outside the bank, and from the precision of the shots, it wasn't one of Jake's men. "Federal troops!" one of the gunmen shouted. "They've got the building surrounded." It wasn't entirely true. Levi could tell from the sound that there was only one rifle involved, but the psychological effect was immediate. Jake's men began to panic, their disciplined assault dissolving into confused retreat. "Get out of here!" Jake yelled, clutching his wounded shoulder. "Fall back to the rendezvous point." As the gunman retreated through the bank, Levi made his way to the window and looked down into the alley. What he saw made him smile for the first time in hours. Sadie, propped against the building's rear wall with her father's damaged rifle, somehow repaired and functional, providing covering fire with the skill of someone who'd learned to shoot before her 13th birthday. "Thought you might need some help," she called up to him as he prepared to descend the rope. "Where did you learn to fix a rifle?" he asked as he reached the ground. "My father taught me more than just how to shoot," she replied, struggling to her feet with the rifle as a makeshift crutch. "He said a woman should know how to maintain her own weapons, especially in country where the nearest gunsmith might be 100 miles away." They could hear Jake's men regrouping inside the bank, preparing for another assault. But they could also hear something else, the distant sound of hoofbeats growing rapidly closer. Either reinforcements were arriving for Jake, or federal troops were finally reaching Butte. "We need to find out which," Levi said, helping Sadie move away from the bank. "But first, there's something you need to see." He showed her Martha's locket and the statement hidden inside. As she read, her expression grew grave with understanding. "She was investigating the same conspiracy as my father," Sadie said quietly, "and they killed her for it, just like they killed my family." "Which means this isn't just about justice anymore," Levi replied, his voice carrying a note of cold determination that Sadie had never heard before. "It's personal." The approaching hoofbeats resolved into a patrol of federal cavalry, led by Captain Webb himself. As the soldiers secured the area around the bank, Webb dismounted and approached with obvious relief. "Thank God you're alive," he said. "We got word that Butte was under attack, but we weren't sure if you'd made it to the bank in time." "We got the documents," Sadie said, patting the leather pouch that contained both sets of evidence. "Everything my father collected, plus additional materials he'd hidden separately." "And we found this." Levi handed Webb the locket and Martha's statement. "My wife was investigating the same conspiracy. They murdered her 2 years ago and made it look like fever." Webb read the statement carefully, his expression growing darker with each line. "This connects the conspiracy to at least 3 other unsolved deaths in the past 2 years. We're not just looking at theft and fraud anymore, we're looking at serial murder." "What about Jake and his men?" Levi asked. "Escaped during the confusion, but we've got the town sealed off. They won't get far." Webb studied Levi's face, noting the change that had come over the deputy since discovering the truth about his wife's death. "What are your intentions regarding the men responsible for Mrs. Cade's murder?" It was a question that went to the heart of what it meant to be a lawman. Levi had sworn an oath to uphold justice, not to pursue personal vengeance. But the line between justice and revenge had become blurred by the discovery that his wife's death was part of the same conspiracy that had destroyed Sadie's family. "I intend to see them brought to trial," he said finally. "All of them, for every crime they've committed and every life they've destroyed." "Even Whitmore?" "Especially Whitmore." Levi looked at the locket in his hands, thinking about the woman who'd worn it and the life they'd planned together. "He's going to answer for what he's done, in a court of law, with proper evidence and due process." "And if he resists arrest?" Webb asked. Levi's smile was cold as winter wind. "Then he'll discover that some old deputies still remember how to handle resisting suspects." As federal troops secured Butte and began the process of restoring order, Levi found himself standing with Sadie in the alley behind the bank where their desperate fight had taken place. The evidence that could bring down Whitmore's conspiracy was safe. Martha's murder would finally be investigated properly, and justice seemed within reach. But Whitmore himself was still free, still dangerous, and still capable of causing more death and destruction. The final confrontation was yet to come, and Levi knew it would test everything he believed about law, justice, and the thin line between a lawman's duty and a husband's grief. "What happens now?" Sadie asked. "Now we finish what your father started," Levi replied, his hand touching the badge on his chest. "And we make sure Martha's death wasn't in vain." The hunt for Clarence Whitmore was about to begin, and Levi Cade intended to be the one who brought him in alive if possible, but brought in nonetheless. The barn bell that Levi had rigged as a warning system began to toll in the pre-dawn darkness, its bronze voice carrying across the valley with urgent insistence. After 3 days of hunting Whitmore's trail through the Montana wilderness, they'd finally cornered him at the abandoned Broken Horn Ranch, 20 miles south of Butte. "How many?" Sadie whispered from her position behind the stone wall that enclosed the ranch's main yard. Levi counted the shadows moving between the buildings, noting the way they positioned themselves with military precision. At least 8, maybe 10. All armed, all professionals. He studied the main house where smoke was rising from the chimney. Whitmore's in there, probably planning his next move. Captain Webb and his federal troops had surrounded the ranch during the night, but they were holding their positions until Levi and Sadie could get close enough to confirm Whitmore's presence. The conspiracy leader had proved more elusive than anyone expected, staying 1 step ahead of federal pursuit through a network of safe houses and loyal supporters. But the trail had finally led here, to a ranch that Sadie's father's documents revealed was secretly owned by Whitmore through a series of shell companies. It was where he'd planned to wait out the federal investigation before fleeing to Mexico with the fortune he'd stolen from territorial funds. "He's not going quietly," Levi observed, watching the defensive preparations taking place around the buildings. "His men are setting up for a siege." The barn bell continued to toll, its rhythm steady and insistent. Levi had rigged it to ring when anyone approached the ranch's main entrance, but the sound seemed to be coming from inside the compound rather than from their position. Someone else was using the bell as a signal. "That's not our bell," Sadie realized. "They're signaling someone." As if summoned by her words, the sound of approaching horses became audible from the north, a large group moving at speed toward the ranch. Reinforcements were arriving for Whitmore, and the federal forces surrounding the compound were about to be outnumbered. "We need to end this now," Levi said, checking his weapons one final time, "before those reinforcements arrive and turn this into a full-scale battle." "What's your plan?" Levi studied the layout of the ranch, noting the defensive positions and possible approaches to the main house. The direct assault that Captain Webb had planned would work, but it would be costly in terms of casualties. There had to be a better way. "The barn," he said, pointing to a large structure that sat between their position and the main house. "If we can get inside without being seen, we might be able to create enough confusion to allow the federal troops to advance." It was risky, but their options were limited. The approaching reinforcements would reach the ranch within minutes, and once they arrived, any chance of taking Whitmore alive would disappear in the chaos of a prolonged firefight. They moved carefully across the open ground, using shadows and debris for cover as they approached the barn. The building was larger than Levi's own barn back at Bitter Creek, with multiple entrances and what appeared to be a hayloft that would provide an excellent vantage point for the final confrontation. The side door was unlocked, which immediately put Levi on alert. Either Whitmore's people had been careless, or they were walking into a trap. But with the sound of reinforcements growing closer, they had no choice but to press forward. The interior of the barn was dimly lit by oil lamps hanging from the crossbeams. Stalls that had once held horses now contained crates of supplies and ammunition, while the center aisle had been cleared to accommodate what appeared to be a meeting area with chairs arranged around a large table. "Planning session," Sadie whispered, noting the maps and documents scattered across the table's surface. Levi examined the materials, recognizing territorial maps marked with military positions and supply routes. Whitmore hadn't just been stealing money, he'd been planning a coordinated campaign to destabilize the entire region. But their discovery was interrupted by the sound of voices from outside the barn. Multiple men were approaching, their conversation clearly audible through the thin walls. "Whitmore wants everyone in position before the federal troops make their move," a familiar voice was saying. It was Jake, his arm in a sling from the wound Levi had given him in Butte, but very much alive and still dangerous. "What about the deputy and the girl?" another voice asked. "They're here somewhere. Whitmore's sure of it." Jake's voice carried a note of anticipation. "He's got special plans for them, especially after what they cost us in Butte." Levi and Sadie exchanged glances, understanding that they'd walked into exactly the trap they'd been trying to avoid. But before either could move, the barn doors burst open and armed men poured in from both ends of the building. "Drop your weapons," Jake commanded, his good arm holding a Colt that was pointed directly at Levi's chest. "Hands where I can see them." They were outnumbered 6-1, with no cover and no way out. Reluctantly, Levi placed his gun on the ground and raised his hands, watching as Sadie did the same. "Smart choice," Jake said with a cold smile. "Mr. Whitmore is eager to meet with you both." As they were escorted from the barn toward the main house, Levi caught a glimpse of the federal positions surrounding the ranch. Captain Webb and his men were in place, but they were waiting for a signal that might never come. If Levi and Sadie disappeared into that house, the federal troops would have no choice but to assault the compound, and the resulting battle would likely destroy any chance of taking Whitmore alive. The main house was a substantial log structure with thick walls and narrow windows, built more like a fortress than a family home. Inside, oil lamps provided warm light that contrasted sharply with the cold efficiency of the men who guarded every entrance. Clarence Whitmore was waiting for them in what had once been the ranch's main sitting room. He'd aged considerably since Levi had last seen him, his face drawn with stress and his eyes holding the haunted look of a man who knew his time was running out. "Deputy Cade," Whitmore said with false cordiality, "and Miss Lane, how good of you to accept my invitation." "Wasn't much of an invitation," Levi replied. "More like a kidnapping." "Details," Whitmore waved dismissively. "The important thing is that we're finally able to have the conversation we should have had days ago." He gestured toward chairs that had been placed in front of his desk, clearly expecting them to sit. When neither moved, his expression hardened. "Sit down," he said, his voice losing all pretense of civility. "We have business to discuss." Reluctantly, they took the offered seats, though Levi noted that their chairs had been positioned to prevent any quick movement toward Whitmore or the room's exits. "You've caused me considerable inconvenience," Whitmore continued, settling behind his desk like a judge preparing to pass sentence. "My entire organization has been disrupted, my associates have been arrested or killed, and my plans for the future have been complicated." "Good," Sadie said flatly. "That was the idea." Whitmore's smile was cold as winter wind. "Indeed, your father would be proud of your dedication to his cause. Of course, he'd also be horrified to know that his daughter's stubbornness is about to cost so many innocent lives." "What do you mean?" Levi asked, though he was already beginning to understand. "The federal troops surrounding this ranch," Whitmore explained. "Captain Webb and his men, all good soldiers following orders. They have no idea that the building they're preparing to assault is filled with enough dynamite to level half the county." The implication hit like a physical blow. Whitmore wasn't planning to surrender or escape. He was planning to take as many federal agents as possible with him when his conspiracy finally collapsed. "You're insane," Sadie breathed. "I'm practical," Whitmore corrected. "If I can't have the territory I've worked so hard to control, then I'll make sure the federal government pays a price for taking it away from me. The deaths of a full company of federal troops will create exactly the kind of instability I need to implement the final phase of my plan." "What final phase?" Levi demanded. Whitmore's smile widened, revealing the true scope of his ambition. "Did you really think this was just about stealing money, Deputy? This has always been about power, the power to reshape this territory according to my vision, free from federal interference and territorial bureaucracy." He stood and moved to a window that overlooked the yard where Captain Webb's men were positioned. "In precisely 10 minutes, whether you cooperate or not, this building is going to explode. The federal troops will be eliminated, you'll be dead, and the evidence you've gathered will be destroyed. I'll slip away in the confusion and implement the next phase of my plan from a secure location." "And what makes you think the federal government won't just send more troops?" Sadie asked. "Because by then, I'll have allies they can't fight." Whitmore's voice took on the fevered tone of a fanatic. "The stolen treaty money I've been using to arm hostile tribes will finally pay dividends. When news of the massacre here reaches the reservation, every warrior between here and the Canadian border will rise up in revolt. The federal government will be too busy fighting a territorial war to worry about one escaped banker." The plan was insane, but Levi could see the twisted logic behind it. A massacre of federal troops would indeed create the kind of crisis that could destabilize the entire region, especially if it coincided with coordinated tribal uprisings funded by stolen government money. "You'll start a war that will kill thousands of innocent people," Levi said. "I'll create the chaos necessary to build something better," Whitmore replied. "Sometimes you have to burn down the old world to make room for the new one." As if to emphasize his point, the barn bell began tolling again, not the steady rhythm of a warning, but the urgent, irregular clanging of someone pulling the rope frantically. Outside, Levi could hear shouts and the sound of running feet as Whitmore's reinforcements finally arrived. "And now," Whitmore said, checking his pocket watch, "we have exactly 8 minutes before this conversation ends permanently." But as the banker gloated over his imminent victory, Levi noticed something he'd missed before, a small bell hanging from a cord near Whitmore's desk, its bronze surface gleaming in the lamplight. It was identical to the barn bell that had been ringing, and suddenly he understood what was really happening. The sound wasn't coming from a warning system, it was coming from someone inside the house, someone who was signaling the federal troops with a prearranged code. Someone who was about to turn Whitmore's trap into his own destruction. The realization that someone inside the house was signaling the federal troops gave Levi the first glimmer of hope he'd felt since being captured. But with only minutes remaining before Whitmore's planned explosion, he needed to act fast to identify their unknown ally and coordinate an escape. 6 minutes, Whitmore announced, consulting his pocket watch with the satisfaction of a man who believed he held all the cards. "I do hope you're prepared to meet your maker, Deputy." But even as the banker spoke, Levi caught a subtle movement from one of the guards stationed near the window. The man's hand was resting on the bell cord, and his eyes met Levi's for just a moment, long enough to communicate recognition and intent. It was Tom Bradley, a former deputy who'd worked with Levi years ago, before leaving law enforcement to try his hand at ranching. Somehow he'd infiltrated Whitmore's organization, and now he was in position to help turn the tables on the conspiracy leader. The next few seconds unfolded with deadly precision. Tom's hand yanked the bell cord 3 times in rapid succession, the old lawman's signal for assault imminent, while simultaneously drawing his concealed weapon. But Whitmore's other guards were quick to react, and the room erupted in gunfire as Tom's cover was blown. Levi dove forward, tackling Whitmore behind his heavy oak desk, just as bullets began flying. Sadie rolled from her chair, seeking cover behind a leather sofa, while drawing the small pistol she'd kept hidden despite the search. "The dynamite!" Whitmore shouted to his remaining men. "Detonate it now!" One of the guards broke from the firefight and ran toward what appeared to be a plunger device connected to wires that disappeared through the floor. But Tom Bradley's shot took him down before he could reach the detonator, and the explosive device remained untriggered. Through the chaos of gunfire and shouting, Levi could hear the distinctive sound of federal troops breaching the house's outer defenses. Captain Webb's men were making their assault, but they were still fighting their way through Whitmore's guards in the other rooms. "It's over, Whitmore," Levi said, pressing his gun against the banker's temple. "Your men are outnumbered. Your plan has failed, and you're under arrest for conspiracy, murder, and treason." But Whitmore's laugh was filled with vicious satisfaction rather than defeat. "You think stopping the explosion saves you? I told you this was about more than one building, Deputy." His hand moved to a leather pouch on his belt, withdrawing what appeared to be a small brass whistle. Before Levi could stop him, he blew 3 sharp blasts that echoed across the valley. "Signal for the tribes," Whitmore explained with malicious glee. "My allies have been waiting for that sound. Within hours, every settlement between here and the Canadian border will be under attack. The war I promised will happen whether I live or die." The implications of coordinated tribal attacks across the territory were staggering. Even if they captured Whitmore, hundreds of innocent people could die in the violence he'd set in motion. But Sadie's voice cut through the chaos with cold determination. "Not if we stop the weapons shipments." She'd been studying the papers scattered across Whitmore's desk, and her tactical mind had immediately grasped the weakness in his plan. "Look at these supply manifests," she said, holding up several documents. "The tribes he's been arming are dependent on regular ammunition resupply. Without it, they can't sustain a prolonged campaign." Levi examined the papers while keeping his gun trained on Whitmore. The banker's face had gone pale as he realized what Sadie had discovered. "The ammunition depot," Levi said, understanding dawning. "He's been storing weapons and supplies for distribution to hostile bands. If we can capture or destroy that depot, the uprising collapses within days," Sadie finished. "Without ammunition, even hostile tribes won't risk prolonged warfare against federal troops." Tom Bradley, despite a wound to his shoulder, had managed to secure the detonator and was now covering the room's entrances as federal troops fought their way closer to their position. "Where's the depot, Whitmore?" Levi demanded. The banker's smile was defiant despite his desperate situation. "You'll never find it in time. And even if you do, there are other depots, other supplies. I've been planning this for years." But as he spoke, Levi noticed something interesting about the maps on Whitmore's desk. They showed the territory's geography in remarkable detail, with various locations marked in different colored inks. Supply routes, meeting points, and what appeared to be depot locations were all carefully annotated. "You documented everything," Levi realized. "Just like any good businessman, you kept detailed records of your operations." Standard practice for complex logistics, Sadie added, her banker's daughter, understanding of business operations proving invaluable. He couldn't coordinate something this complicated without detailed planning documents. The sound of federal troops reaching the house's main hallway announced that Captain Webb's assault was succeeding. But time was still critical. If Whitmore had indeed signaled the beginning of coordinated attacks, they needed to move quickly to prevent widespread bloodshed. "Tom," Levi called to his former colleague, "can you secure these maps and get them to Captain Webb?" "Already on it," Tom replied, gathering the documents despite his wounded condition. "But we've got another problem. Some of Whitmore's men got away during the assault. They're probably heading for the depot to warn the others." It was a race against time now. Federal troops would need to move immediately to secure the ammunition depots before Whitmore's surviving associates could distribute the weapons or relocate the supplies. "How long to reach the main depot?" Levi asked, studying the maps. 4 hours by horse, Whitmore said reluctantly, apparently deciding that cooperation might save his life. "But they'll be watching for pursuit. You'll never make it in time." But Sadie was examining the maps with the intensity of someone who understood the strategic situation. "Not if we take the direct route," she said, "but if we approach from the north, using the old mining trails." 2 hours, Levi finished, recognizing the terrain she was indicating. "Maybe less if we push hard." Captain Webb burst into the room at that moment, his uniform torn and blackened from the assault, but his expression fierce with determination. "Status report, Deputy. Whitmore's in custody. The explosion's been prevented, but he's signaled for coordinated tribal attacks across the territory." Levi replied quickly. "We have the location of his main ammunition depot, but his people are probably moving the supplies as we speak." Webb studied the maps Tom had secured, his military mind immediately grasping the tactical situation. "I can have a full company mounted and moving within 20 minutes. But if they're already relocating, then we need to move faster than they expect," Sadie interrupted. "A small team, using the mountain routes, might be able to get there before they finish loading the supplies." "Absolutely not," Webb said firmly. "You've done enough, Miss Lane. We can handle this from here." But Levi was already checking his weapons and preparing for immediate departure. "She's right about the timing, Captain, and she knows these supply manifests better than anyone. If we're going to stop this uprising before it starts, we need her knowledge." "And my motivation," Sadie added quietly. "Whitmore killed my family to start this conspiracy. I want to be there when we finish it." Webb looked between them, recognizing the determination in their faces and the tactical value of their partnership. "1 hour," he said finally. "You have 1 hour to reach that depot and assess the situation. My troops will follow the main route and provide backup, but if you encounter serious resistance—" "We'll handle it," Levi said, the weight of his badge and the memory of Martha's murder giving steel to his voice. As they prepared for what might be their final confrontation with Whitmore's conspiracy, Levi found himself thinking about the branding iron that hung in the ranch's blacksmith chopper tool for marking ownership, for claiming what belonged to you. In a few hours, they would either claim victory over the forces that had destroyed so many innocent lives, or they would join the list of casualties in Whitmore's war against justice. Either way, Levi Cade intended to make sure that Clarence Whitmore's conspiracy ended where it had begun, with the truth, backed by the courage of people who refused to let evil go unchallenged. The final ride to the ammunition depot was about to begin, and this time there would be no retreat and no surrender. Justice demanded nothing less than complete victory, and Levi was prepared to pay whatever price that victory required. 6 months later, Levi Cade stood in the doorway of his rebuilt barn, watching the morning sun paint the Montana prairie in shades of gold and amber. The structure was larger than his original barn, built with federal compensation money and designed to serve not just as a working building, but as a symbol of resilience in the face of overwhelming adversity. The rope that had once hung from the crossbeam was gone, replaced by a brass bell that chimed softly in the morning breeze. It was the same bell that had signaled the final confrontation at Whitmore's depot, now serving as a reminder of how quickly circumstances could change and how important it was to listen for the sounds that mattered. "Morning, Deputy," Sadie called from the house, her voice carrying easily across the yard. She was walking more steadily now, supported by a specially crafted cane rather than the makeshift crutches she'd used during their desperate flight through the mountains. Her recovery had been slow but steady, and her determination had never wavered. "Morning, Marshal," Levi replied, noting the new badge that gleamed on her shirt. The territorial governor had appointed her as the first female federal marshal in Montana's history, a position that recognized both her role in exposing Whitmore's conspiracy and her exceptional qualifications for law enforcement. The ammunition depot raid had been successful beyond their wildest hopes. They'd arrived just as Whitmore's men were loading the last of the weapons into wagons for distribution to hostile tribes, and the combination of surprise, determination, and federal backup had resulted in the capture of the entire supply network. Without the promised weapons and ammunition, the coordinated uprising had collapsed before it could begin, saving countless innocent lives. Clarence Whitmore himself was currently awaiting trial in the territorial capital, charged with conspiracy, treason, murder, and theft of federal funds. The evidence from Sadie's father's investigation, combined with Martha's statement and the documents they'd recovered from the bank, had built an unshakable case that reached all the way to Washington. Several territorial officials had already been arrested, and the federal investigation was continuing to uncover the full scope of the corruption network. "Any word from Captain Webb?" Sadie asked as she joined Levi at the barn door. "Telegram came in this morning. The last of Whitmore's associates was arrested in Denver yesterday. The conspiracy is officially finished." Levi held up a document that bore the territorial seal, and this came with it. Sadie examined the paper, her eyes widening as she read. "The deed to your ranch completely clear, with all foreclosure proceedings voided. More than that, the territory's paying damages for the fraudulent foreclosure, plus compensation for the house and everything else we lost." Levi gestured toward the expanded ranch buildings, the new corrals, and the small herd of cattle grazing in the distance. "Turns out fighting corruption can be profitable if you survive it." They walked together through the rebuilt ranch, noting the improvements that federal compensation had made possible. The house was larger and more comfortable than the one that had burned, with proper accommodations for Sadie's limited mobility and space for the law enforcement equipment they'd need in their new roles. "Do you miss it?" Sadie asked suddenly. The excitement, the danger, the feeling that everything was on the line. Levi considered the question seriously. The past 6 months had been peaceful compared to their desperate fight against Whitmore's conspiracy, but they'd also been deeply satisfying in ways he hadn't expected. Building something instead of just fighting to survive, planning for the future instead of merely trying to reach the next day alive. "I miss the certainty," he said finally, "knowing exactly what we were fighting for and why it mattered. But I don't miss the fear, the constant threat, the feeling that we might not live to see justice done. And now we get to be the people who make sure that kind of corruption doesn't take root again." Levi touched the marshal's badge on his chest, a federal appointment that recognized his role in exposing the conspiracy. "It's different work, but it's important work." They paused at Martha's grave, which had been relocated to a peaceful spot near the creek where wildflowers bloomed throughout the growing season. Levi had added a proper headstone, paid for with federal compensation money, that read, "Martha Cade, beloved wife and unsung hero in the fight for justice." She would have liked Sadie, Levi said quietly, speaking to the woman who'd been gone for 2 years, but whose memory still shaped his understanding of right and wrong. "I would have liked her too," Sadie replied, understanding that some conversations included more than just the people who were physically present. As they continued their walk, they encountered Tom Bradley, who'd recovered from his wounds and accepted a position as chief deputy for their expanded law enforcement district. He was supervising the installation of telegraph equipment that would keep them connected to federal authorities and other law enforcement agencies across the territory. "Any problems with the new equipment?" Levi asked. None that we can't handle, Tom replied. Though I have to say, this modern law enforcement is a lot more complicated than the old days when we just pinned on a badge and rode out to handle whatever trouble was brewing. More complicated but more effective, Sadie observed. When law enforcement agencies communicate and coordinate, conspiracies like Whitmore's become much harder to sustain. It was a lesson they'd learned the hard way during their fight against the corruption network. Isolation had been one of Whitmore's greatest advantages, the ability to operate in territories where local officials didn't communicate with federal authorities, where evidence could be destroyed before it reached the right people, where witnesses could be eliminated without anyone asking questions. Speaking of communication, Tom said, we got a request from the federal marshal's office in Wyoming. They're dealing with some irregularities in territorial mining permits that sound familiar. Wondered if we might be available for consultation. Levi and Sadie exchanged glances, recognizing the pattern. Corruption rarely operated in isolation. Where one network was exposed, others were often discovered. How long would it take to get there? Sadie asked. 3 days by train now that the railroads extended service through the territory, Tom replied. Lot easier than the old days of horseback travel through the mountains. We'll consider it, Levi said. But first, we have some business to finish here. That evening, as the sun set over the Montana prairie, Levi and Sadie sat on the porch of their rebuilt house, watching the last light fade from the western sky. It was a scene of domestic tranquility that would have been unimaginable during their desperate flight from Whitmore's killers, but which now felt as natural as breathing. I have something for you, Sadie said, reaching into her pocket to withdraw a small wrapped package. Inside was a new deputy's badge, the federal marshal's badge she wore, but a traditional local deputy's star, like the one Levi had worn during his first years in law enforcement. I don't understand, he said. It's from the people of Bitter Creek and the surrounding ranches, Sadie explained. They petitioned the territorial governor to create a new law enforcement district with you as the chief deputy. Federal authority when we need it, local accountability for day-to-day justice. Levi examined the badge, noting the careful craftsmanship and the way it caught the last rays of sunlight. It represented something he'd thought was lost forever, the opportunity to serve his community directly, to be the kind of lawman who knew every family in his territory and understood that justice was about more than just enforcing laws. What about your federal marshal position? He asked. I keep that too. Best of both worlds, local authority for local problems, federal resources for cases that cross territorial lines. Sadie's smile was warm with affection and respect. Partners, just like we agreed. As the stars emerged in the darkening sky, Levi found himself thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. It had started with a rope and a barn, and a desperate man who'd lost hope, but it had led to justice served, lives saved, and a future that held promise instead of despair. Do you think your father would be proud? He asked. I think he'd be amazed, Sadie replied. He set out to expose financial corruption in a small territorial bank. He probably never imagined it would lead to the first female federal marshal in Montana history, or the complete restructuring of territorial law enforcement. And your family, do you think they'd approve of how this ended? Sadie was quiet for a long moment, considering the question seriously. I think they'd be glad that their deaths led to something meaningful, that the evidence my father gathered helped prevent a war that could have killed thousands of innocent people. That's worth more than personal revenge could ever be. The brass bell chimed softly in the evening breeze, its voice carrying across the valley like a benediction. It was the sound of peace, of justice served, of two people who'd found each other in the darkest moments of their lives and built something lasting from the wreckage of their separate tragedies. What's next? Levi asked, though he already knew the answer. Tomorrow we start again, Sadie replied. New cases, new challenges, new opportunities to make sure that justice reaches everyone who needs it. And tonight? Tonight we rest, and we remember that sometimes the end of one story is just the beginning of another. As they sat together on the porch of their rebuilt home, surrounded by the evidence of their survival and success. Levi Cade understood that he'd found something more valuable than the ranch he'd almost lost or the life he'd almost thrown away. He'd found purpose, partnership, and the kind of love that grew not from desperation, but from mutual respect and shared commitment to something larger than themselves. The barn at Bitter Creek stood solid and strong in the moonlight, its brass bells silent now but ready to ring again when duty called. And somewhere in the darkness, Deputy Levi Cade and Marshal Sadie Lane prepared for whatever tomorrow might bring, secure in the knowledge that some partnerships were strong enough to survive anything, even hope.